listening to Hooked on Startups, where every week you'll hear from some of the most talented, inspiring, and successful entrepreneurs who shared their real-life stories, how they overcame challenges and failures, and how they mastered success. Get ready for some of the best business tips, tricks and tactics, and some frank, unscripted discussions. Here's your host, Matthew Sullivan.
On today's episode of Hooked on Startups, I'm delighted to have Marc Boiron with me. Marc, welcome to Hooked on Startups.
Thank you for having me here, Matthew. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Great. Well, Marc, you're an attorney at Rutan and Tucker in Orange County. There's I got paragraphs of stuff here about what you focus on, your expertise, the fact that you specialize in Delaware corporate laws, California corporate laws. How would you best describe your area of expertise? So just so I don't completely screw it up for anyone that's listening.
No, fair enough. So I started practicing in Delaware, where there's only something like 5,000 or 6,000 attorneys. So there's very few of us. I've practiced there for a few years before moving out to the West Coast. And it's actually really interesting the way my practice has changed. So having specialized in Delaware law, Delaware is actually one of the leading states, if not jurisdictions in general in the world when it comes to blockchain technology. And so I got very interested in that. And once I moved out to the West Coast, I started practicing more in the blockchain space, and I've moved most of my practice to focusing on blockchain technology.
See, that's interesting because Delaware typically is the corporate structure that VCs will insist on. So a Delaware C Corp or S Corp. What is it that's particularly different about Delaware corporate law compared to Wyoming or Nevada or California, for example?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So a lot of people think that it's a tax issue, which it really isn't. The key thing in Delaware that you get is a body of law that's a lot more developed than you get in any other state. So you've had, tens and tens of years, decades, where you've had the Delaware Court of Chancery interpreting Delaware case law. You've had the Delaware corporate code that gets amended annually. And then you have trust in the system in Delaware. You have very good judges over there that you don't necessarily get otherwise in other places. Part of the reason that is those judges are appointed rather than elected. And so you get very high quality judges over there. So there's a whole host of reasons, most of which are really focused on the law themselves rather than anything else. And with blockchain being a perfect example of it, they stay abreast on what's going on in the world and make sure that the laws are updated based on what's happening in the world. I mean, they just updated the Delaware corporate code this year to specifically contemplate having shares issued on the blockchain, which is something that can't be said for any other jurisdiction, at least in the US.
And so when we talk about the blockchain, it's very difficult to really sort of quantify, or is it difficult to sort of quantify one particular area? So what did Delaware focus on when they talked about bringing blockchain technology into corporate law? What was their main focal point?
Yeah, it's interesting. So they actually created what's referred to as the Delaware Blockchain Initiative. And it's really an initiative to look at blockchain as a whole and its implementation in the state of Delaware. And one small kind of part of that is, hey, let's make sure we stay ahead of everyone else on the corporate side of that. And the way that started was really on, hey, we've got companies that would be interested in issuing shares on the blockchain. And so really that means is make sure that we can distribute shares on a distributed ledger, essentially, that really isn't owned by any one person or any one company. And move on like that. And there's actually a company doing that. So Overstock.com has actually issued shares on the blockchain. I believe it was the first one to do that. But it's broader than that. So by the end of this year, Delaware has the goal of having all of their UCC filings on the blockchain. So that's whenever there's a lender that makes a secured loan, the way they're going to secure that loan is through a UCC filing. Those UCC filings are then going to be put on the blockchain. That's going to permit, through the smart contract mechanism, of being able to automatically renew these UCC filings, automatically terminate them. Lenders may be able to sync their systems with the blockchain and the UCC filings there. And in the future, Delaware is looking to move, even the filing of certificates of incorporation onto the blockchain. blockchain. And once you start doing that, you start being able to avoid some of the issues that exist with, for example, companies that issue shares above what they've actually authorized in their certificate of incorporation. Because if you issue them on the blockchain and there's a cap that's set in there, you won't be able to actually do that. So there's plenty of benefits that you get from Delaware moving there, and they are slowly moving there. And it's probably one of the best examples of why it is that blockchain is really here to stay, because you wouldn't have that kind of money and effort invested in Delaware if that weren't the case.
Let's talk about the difference between blockchain and cryptocurrencies, because there seems to be a blurring where some people think that cryptocurrencies are the blockchain and that the blockchain is a cryptocurrency. But clearly, as far as Delaware are concerned, they're looking at it from a technological perspective. They're saying that there is better technology that we can use for some of the systems that we currently have centralized. And blockchain provides a more robust, distributed technological solution for that. But how do we fold cryptocurrencies and all the recent hype and flurry of excitement in the ICO or initial coin offering space? How do we think that Delaware and some of the other domiciles will be able to work with this new asset class?
Yeah, so it's interesting from a Delaware perspective, because it's a new way of raising capital, and it's a way that almost avoids the Delaware infrastructure in a way, right? So now you're not issuing shares anymore, but you're issuing tokens or selling tokens on the blockchain, which completely avoids the need to issue shares. Now, what a lot of people forget is you're not totally out of Delaware's jurisdiction if you're a Delaware corporation, for example. So one of the best examples is people always ask, well, if we are a Delaware corporation, if we've brought in investors in the past, or let's say you have VC money that you've raised, can you just go ahead and issue tokens in whatever way you want? And the answer is no. As a Delaware company, and especially the directors, officers, controlling shareholders of a Delaware company, you owe fiduciary duties to all of your stockholders, every single one of them. And so when you've brought in investors and you're looking at whether you want to do an ICO or not and sell tokens, you need to consider the interests of all of your stockholders, including your investors. And so if you go ahead, and we've seen this on occasion with companies that sell tokens that have basically look like securities but aren't. And so one form of that might be a token that provides the right to receive revenue, a percentage of the company's revenue, or a percentage of profits. All types of tokens that most people in the space would agree is really not the intended use of the token. But what that's doing is really taking out capital from the investors. I mean, the investors would rather see the revenue come into the company, turn into profit, and then be distributed to them in the form of a dividend or when the company's sold. When you strip it out through a token sale, you start running into issues as to whether you've breached your fiduciary duties. You owe the fiduciary duties to the stockholders and make sure that you are benefiting them. So one of the biggest issues in the space is you see founders often receiving tokens in ICO sales. It's very typical where you have, you'll see a pie chart in a white paper for an ICO, and that pie chart will show that there's a certain percentage of tokens going to the public, a certain percentage going to advisors, a certain percentage going to founders. Well, when those founders are receiving the tokens to the detriment of investors, you now have an issue where the founders have preferred themselves over the investors, and you have a potential case for breach of fiduciary duty, and probably a very good one.
So that's where you've got an existing company that has raised capital through sort of more traditional routes, and then wants to somehow dilute its earnings through the issuance of tokens. What about where you have a company which is a startup company? And again, let's just remind everyone why we're focusing on Delaware here. Is the first question. Second part of that question is, why are we seeing so many companies going offshore and really trying to sort of skirt around all of the US SEC and IRS regulations?
Yeah, so I mean, a startup currently has, and always has had for a while now, especially since the Jobs Act, a wide range of options when it comes to raising capital. So some of those options you've got under Reg D. You can have an offering to accredited investors, whether that's a 506c offering, that can be marketed to the public, or a 506B offering. You also have Reg CF, that is an option when it comes to raising up to $1 million to accredited and non-accredited investors. And then you have Reg A plus, that's an option when it comes to raising, either $20 million under tier 1 or up to $50 million under tier 2 from both accredited and non-accredited investors. That's something that's been around now since kind of the Jobs Act, although it took a while to implement.
So it's been around for 2 or 3 years, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And you've seen a lot of development. I mean, the Reg CF area is one where there's a lot of kind of thresholds and issues to deal with for raising $1 million. Reg A plus has been used a lot more, especially in the real estate space. But recently, and it's just a question of entrepreneurs looking to kind of find new ways to raise capital, they started looking at the concept of these initial coin offerings, so ICOs. Some people refer to them as token generation events. And the idea, which really, when you think about it, it's a preferred use of the term. You'd rather use token generation events than ICOs, because it's very unfortunate that we started comparing this new form of capital raising to an initial public.
To an IPO, exactly, yes.
That's exactly right. So that is unfortunate, and token generation event is really a preferable term. But ultimately, people were trying to find a way to raise capital, companies, without having to really deal with securities laws, and do it in a way where they could reach everybody, and not just in the US, but around the world. And ICOs let you do that. Basically, the way most of these ICOs work is you've got a company that issues a white paper. The white paper basically describes the business, and then describes the code. In many instances, absolutely just lays it out. And after laying that out, it basically says, we'll go ahead and we're going to sell tokens on these terms as set forth in the white paper. Those tokens, then are sold to investors who can buy them, and the company can raise as much as they're able to. And you see different ways in which this is done. Sometimes you'll see companies that basically say, hey, let's go crazy and raise as much as we want. They have no cap on it whatsoever. A somewhat recent example is Tezos, and you've got some litigation in that space right now.
Yeah, and Tezos, just to give you some idea, I mean, Tezos, what was the figure? It was $400 million? Or was it higher than that?
I think it was right around 250 million, but the current value of the Ether is somewhere around 400 million.
So in other words, and Tezos really was I think it's an alternative trading platform. Is that a fairly...
Yeah, I think it's another way of developing blockchain technology.
But this is a startup, effectively.
Oh yeah, they essentially had no operations. I believe they raised some VC money, but this was as an early stage round. So it was probably, I think it was seed stage money.
But what does that tell us really? So you've got a company that is at very much early stage, and they're having all sorts of internal issues, which is covered daily in the press in terms of the ownership of the company. But that company raised $250 million based on a white paper, which is really a diluted version of a private placing memorandum. But what does that tell us about the velocity of change in the fact that we saw the crowdfunding legislation come in 3 or 4 years ago, and that had a sort of relatively slow uptake, and it's adopted now, but it didn't have that same sort of universal adoption that we were hoping for. Out of nowhere, we saw these ICOs come in the last 6 months. $2 billion, something like that, has been raised. Basically, pick a figure.
Yeah, I think as of August, I think we're at $2.4 billion, which was 4 times more than the amount that had been raised in VC money to date this year. So it is an incredible amount of money. But
there must be, so let's just explore. I mean, the first question is, why is there so much velocity in the capital raising? Why do people believe that cryptocurrencies, blockchain, these types of technologies are so important that they have to sell their houses to get into it?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. I mean, one fundamentally is if you go look and you read about blockchain technology, you're going to see a lot of people talking about Web 3.0 and really the next internet. And what people remember when it came to the internet is that there's a lot of people that made a lot of money very quickly. in the late 90s. And so they want to take part in that. They don't want to miss out on that. So that's really one big reason. A second reason is you've seen a significant increase in the value of Bitcoin. And so you have young folks who put some money into Bitcoin and now have millions of dollars. And then you have people who have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in Bitcoin. And, the diversification is a tried and true method of accumulating wealth. And so people don't want to just hold, all their money in Bitcoins. And so they're looking to put their money elsewhere. And again, given that sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say in terms of scale. So just to give us a reference point, I haven't checked today, but the overall value of all of the cryptocurrencies and tokens that have been issued that are currently traded is around $175 billion, something like that. So to give everyone an idea that this is not a niche market, or funnily enough, I think it is a niche market, because I was listening to one commentator the other day, and he was saying that there are only 4 million or so active Bitcoin wallets. So that $175 billion is held by, a relatively small number of people. So is this the tip of the iceberg, do you think? Or are we at, the very beginning of some massive growth? And are you evidencing that by the type of people that you're working with? In other words, are you seeing long-established firms adopting these types of technologies, asking you about ICOs?
Yeah, so it is very interesting, is that you are seeing a move, I'd call it a move towards maturity, especially in the ICO space. I think blockchain generally, I think mature companies have been focused on blockchain technology for a year or two now, maybe even longer in some instances. But the understanding that blockchain is going to be important, and the exact use and application of blockchain technology is not necessarily clear right now, but it's something that's going to develop and is going to be important. But what you are seeing is, specifically in the ICO space, is you're seeing fewer startups, like true startups that have not raised any capital, does not have any infrastructure whatsoever. You're seeing fewer of those in the ICO space, and you're seeing a lot more mature companies that are looking at the ICO as a way of doing one of two things: either raising money in a way that actually supplements the existing technology that they have, or of actually creating a product for their company that they didn't have in the past. And so those two uses are very appealing to blockchain companies in general, and even mature companies that aren't yet in the blockchain space but want to move there.
All of these transactions that I've seen have been offshore. So these are companies that have launched their token generation events or initial coin offerings. They've all been apparently domiciled offshore, using various foundations, Swiss foundations, Gibraltar companies. So it seems like it's been a case of let's dust off, all of those old journals that we used to read about how to set up a company to avoid US tax and US securities regulations, in brackets, that never work. So how do we reconcile the fact that the ICO market, or the TGE market rather, is becoming more mature in this sort of Benjamin Button-esque way, whilst at the same time, most of these, if not all of these offerings, are offshore? How do you reconcile those two tensions?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I've only seen a couple just pure Reg D ICOs. Other than that, they are offshore. And the reason for that, there's a few reasons. One is the ICOs are truly global, right? Before this, you'd have, Reg D offerings that would just be done in the US, or you might end up having somebody internationally. Reg CF had to be in the US. Reg A Plus, you might have a few international people, but you'd see people mostly domestically. But the ICOs are truly international, and in many instances, just as much money is being raised outside of the US than in the US. And so there's really no reason to need to be set up in the US. But to answer your question specifically, the tax laws in the US have, in the cryptocurrency space and in the ICO space, really haven't been developed much. So if you go to an area like the Cayman Islands, where there are no taxes, where you have now suddenly shifted an entire kind of body of concern away, and it no longer exists because there are no tax issues in the Cayman Islands. And so there's really two benefits to being there. I mean, and I'm sure there are others, but two main ones. One being you don't have to be directly concerned with U.S. tax laws, with an exception that I will touch on. And number two is there are no taxes. The exception that I was going to touch on is if you are selling in the U.S. as a foreign company, you're still going to need to deal with U.S. tax laws, but you're not going to have to deal with them to the same extent and degree as you would if you were a U.S. company selling in the U.S.
A lot of the companies that you're talking to, though, are established U.S. companies. We were mentioning earlier about how you've got fewer startups, but you've got U.S.-based companies that are looking to move into, the token generation opportunities. What do they do? Because it's going to be very difficult for them to claim that they're an offshore entity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to do it, and this is where having a good tax firm is very helpful. But basically, what they end up doing is they set up a new entity, let's say in the Cayman Islands, and they transfer existing IP to the Cayman Islands. Now, that part is worth focusing on for a second, because the transfer of the IP from the U.S. to the Cayman Islands is a taxable event, and it's something that is very expensive to do. Most accounting firms that I've dealt with, and CPA firms, have been quoting and generally charge somewhere around $150,000 to $200,000 just for purposes of valuing the IP and structuring that entire aspect of the transaction. That does not even necessarily go to kind of the upfront work in terms of, hey, where is it that we should be located? So the cost of moving outside the U.S. is definitely expensive.
And let's look at some of the other costs as well. I think one of the fallacies that seems to be flying around is that anyone can really set up their own ICO within a matter of weeks, couple of weeks, get it out there, raise a few $1 million. So let's explore the reality of what costs are involved. One of the things you talked about just now was if you're an existing company moving part of your business offshore. That's obviously one major cost, but let's look at the other costs. And also in terms of personnel, can you legitimately have a claim to have an offshore company if your personnel are building this and providing the service out of the US, for example?
Yeah, and so I'll take those in kind of backwards order, reverse order. In terms of the individuals, the answer is you are going to need to have some operations over there. So what you'll hear some of the tax firms say is, we need you to actually have developers, in the Cayman Islands, for example. They can't all be located somewhere else. So you're going to need to actually establish a real presence over there. It's not good enough to call an attorney in the Cayman Islands, set up an entity, draft up some paperwork, send your IP over there, and then launch your ICO. That's not going to be good enough. So you're going to need some real operations over there. And that takes some planning, and it's going to take some capital to do that. In terms of the costs to do an ICO, and you hit the nail on the head. 9-10 months ago, you would basically put out a white paper. You'd have a marketing budget. You might hire legal. That's really about it. And you launch it, and your costs would be pretty low. But ever since, and I think it really came down to the SEC's guidance in July of this year, people have been a lot more focused on doing the ICOs right. And there is no doubt that the recent Tezos developments are going to increase the focus even more, especially after you've had several firms come out saying they're investigating Tezos to bring potential class action lawsuits, some of which are focused on whether those tokens are securities or not securities. But going back to the cost specifically, you're going to have legal fees, and those legal fees, depending on the size of the firm that you're talking about, are probably going to range from $150,000 to $300,000. Some of those firms are going to be willing to take some kind of deferred fee payment. Others are not. In a hot market right now, like it is in the ICO space, where everyone's busy, it's a lot harder to find that, but it's still out there. You're going to need to get tax advice. That tax advice, depending on whether you're going to one of the big four firms or another one, depending on those IP transfer issues that may or may not exist, you're looking from anywhere from $100,000 to I've seen up to $500,000 just on that accounting. And that's a really established company that has a lot of IP to transfer and a lot of planning.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it. You have some companies that are going to look for help drafting their white papers. So there's going to be an additional cost there. Smart contracts are going to get audited. So you're talking about $10,000 to $30,000 there to audit a smart contract.
That's from a security perspective, presumably, just to make sure is that what you're talking about, the security of the smart contract?
That's exactly right. Just to make sure that there's no holes in there. I mean, the whole issue with DAO was really basically a coding problem, a problem with the smart contract. And so to have a successful ICO, you want to be able to go out there and say, yeah, we've had a well-established or relatively well-established for how short of a period of time these companies have been around, company that has actually audited our smart contracts. So that's important. And then after that, you've got things that, PR is going to be expensive, marketing is going to be expensive, and the budgets are range greatly. Part of it is really how many people are you bringing on board to do that yourself? Are you hiring an outside firm to do it? And then there's things like pay-per-click. Are you paying to do pay-per-click advertising, which can get very expensive, especially if you just right now Google initial coin offering, the thing that you're going to get everywhere is pay-per-click ads. And so those are going to be very expensive. The truth is, from an attorney's perspective, I personally don't think those are a very good idea. And the reason for that is most of it's probably the way in which they're done. Is what you see right now is a pay-per-click ad that says, hey, you've got a 50% discount on this pre-sale. Don't let it go, essentially, because it's here for another day or two. And that's just a recipe for disaster.
And again, excuse me, it's almost like a recurrence of the same mistakes that were made with the sale of pink sheets. And it's almost like you've got the regulators on one side thinking, okay, we've got the crowdfunding legislation, the Jobs Act, we've got Reg D, we've got Reg A, we've got a handle on this. And then out of nowhere, out of left field comes the token generation events. And with all of the wolves of Wall Street that it brings with it in terms of, promised returns, expectations, buy now, pay later. Where do you see the big issues unfolding, and what do you think you're going to be focusing on in 12 months' time?
Yeah, I think right now and I don't know that it's going to change. There's a focus on whether these tokens are considered to be securities or not. That is kind of the well-known Howey test, which kind of in an impressive way, most entrepreneurs in this space really now know the Howey test pretty well. It's not necessarily an easy test to apply, but it's a test that people are quite familiar with now. And so there's going to be a continued focus on evaluating whether a token is a security or a utility token. And I think that's a very important process, because what you end up seeing is every single one of these tokens are different in one way or another. And what you need to look at, and what my initial question is whenever I'm evaluating any of these projects, is please describe your token. And then it gets described, and my follow-up question is, okay, so what does it do, and how does it add value to your existing company, or how does it permit you to create something that couldn't be created before? And a lot of the times when you're answering those questions, if you are able to answer them, then you probably do have a utility token, or can have a utility token rather than a security. And the reason I differentiate between having one and possibly having one really comes down to one of the prongs in the Howey test, which is making sure that basically the profits that you receive cannot be predominantly based on the efforts of as a result of the efforts of others. And what you end up seeing, and I think this is pretty well known now, is that a lot of the times, especially these earlier stage companies and less with mature stage companies, is they come out, they raise capital through an initial coin offering, and they launch the token immediately without having actually developed the underlying platform. Well, in that instance, the token holders now rely on the company to actually develop the platform. So they are now relying predominantly on the efforts of others, with the reason for doing that basically being because they expect the token to increase in value. And so that is a problem. But the reason I say you can get around with that is the way to structure ICOs that are going to comply with U.S. securities laws, at least nowadays, is if you need capital to actually build out your platform. You do one of two things. Either you do a normal, Reg D offering, or you could even do a Reg CF campaign, which could be used from a marketing perspective as well to in a way market the ICO, although it'd have to be done in a sensitive way. Or the way of doing it is a Reg D offering, using what's referred to as a SAFT, a simple agreement for future tokens, which is basically a play on a SAFE, which is a simple agreement for future equity that has been used for several years now in the startup space. Once you raise that money on a SAFT, you then go out and build the platform. Once the platform's fully built out, assuming your token really is a utility token in nature rather than a security, then you can sell those tokens without actually having it be treated, at least in the US, as a security.
And that's very interesting because that's a two-stage process. So you almost have your seed capital or your build-out capital comes from a section of the tokens that you're pre-selling under the banner of the crowdfunding regulation D. So that means that you're restricted to accredited investors only. But as you were saying earlier, most of the people investing are sitting on tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin profits anyway.
Yeah, and the truth is it doesn't force you to undertake a process that's any different than what you would do otherwise. It might extend the process a little bit, but what you see in these ICOs, and I don't know that I've ever seen one that hasn't had a pre-sale of tokens anyway, is rather than having a pre-sale of tokens followed immediately by an ICO, you're just doing a pre-sale that's a little bit earlier, only to accredited investors. And then what you're actually seeing nowadays is often a pre-sale to public investors once that platform's actually built out, and then the actual full ICO afterwards.
If you're dealing with a pre-sale to the public, as it were, is that something that you can do in a compliant way as well as far as securities regulations are concerned?
Yeah, and it's a good point of clarifying. So a lot of times what happens is that initial sale that I was referring to under Reg D pursuant to the SAFT, usually what happens is there's a group of the entrepreneurs will go to either an investment banker. There's things like the Argonne Group that are well known, that'll basically go out and find investors, institutional essentially investors for you. That's the kind of initial pre-sale that you see. You then do a public pre-sale, and that public pre-sale, you would still want that to come under Reg D. Okay. If you haven't fully built out your platform yet. That's really gonna depend on whether you've fully built out your platform yet. Because if you haven't, you still do not want to be selling anything that comes near.
And the great thing about tokens is that they are immediately tradable compared to something like a normal Reg D offering, where the securities that you buy are sort of locked up under one of the various securities regulations. Yeah. So you can invest in a company at a startup stage or at an early stage, and your tokens can then be immediately tradable. So do you think are we going to end up with this sort of split between the traditional IPO listed securities world? Are we going to have a whole parallel economy, do you think, with companies raising capital through TGEs?
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing that develop. I think that's probably what's already out there in terms of, if you look at all the currencies that are tradable on exchanges right now, you're basically seeing that. Now, what I think we're going to see is basically a move towards quality. As you have more mature companies coming to this space, people are focusing more on the regulations, you're going to get a bigger focus on quality, and you're going to start seeing tokens out there that have kind of true utility underlying them, and people are going to be buying them for two reasons. One is they'll always be bought for profit, even though that's not necessarily the main purpose of a utility token. But some utility tokens are going to have significant value to users of that token, and so they're going to be bought for that reason as well, which is very obviously different than the IPO market, where you have the only use being profit.
But also, again, we've got different exchanges in different countries. So, we have NASDAQ and the various sort of, exchanges in the US, in the UK. Do you see that there's going to be almost like a one big market, one big exchange, or a huge sort of parallelism going on where money is diverted from all because the rules, regulations, and cost involved in maintaining your public status in the US compared to listing your shares effectively through tokens is night and day.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think you're going to see continued use of these exchanges. Whether you're going to see a consolidation of the exchanges themselves or not is actually a very interesting question. And the biggest reason is, blockchain, kind of the underlying concept is really a decentralized concept that kind of lets anybody do anything in a way. And so that's kind of been the view on these exchanges as well, is we can set up a foreign exchange where there's very few regulations and trade the currencies on that exchange. And so, it's hard to see that going away. What I do think you'll see, though, and you see it with Coinbase being used to purchase, whether it's Bitcoin or Litecoin or Ether, you see a huge focus on kind of one trusted source. Yes. Yeah. Coinbase. And while Coinbase has its own exchange, I don't think it's kind of viewed at the same level as Coinbase, but it wouldn't necessarily be surprising, especially as you get more and more regulation in the ICO space and with cryptocurrencies, that you'd see an exchange that's trusted emerge. I mean, there's some that are viewed more positively than others already, but not to the same level as you see with Coinbase. And I think that'll happen eventually.
And again, from your experience, I mean, we've seen, we've seen China shut down ICOs. A number of other domiciles and a number of other jurisdictions have rejected cryptocurrencies, and they see them as dangerous, destabilizing. Where do you see the future of cryptocurrencies in a US sort of democratic environment?
Yeah, I think the cryptocurrencies are not necessarily going to, from a regulatory perspective, are not necessarily going to change much. I mean, there's going to be a big shakeup, I think, from a tax perspective, because whether you want to call it tax avoidance or tax ignorance, there's been a lot of that going on. Whether it's companies that are selling tokens in the US and not paying taxes on those token sales, or people holding Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies and selling them without necessarily actually disclosing those sales and paying taxes on the gains. That's definitely an area where you're going to see shakeup. I think from an SEC perspective, I think they've come out and they've given their view, granted at a very high level, that these are securities. I think what you're going to see more and more is what you've already seen, which is enforcement actions from the SEC. And current enforcement actions have really only been in the context of fraud. But I think you'll start seeing more and more focus kind of on actions kind of on the fringes from the SEC. And so that might be where we're going to see more of a shakeout. But I don't think the ICO regulatory framework in the in the US is necessarily going to change significantly.
It must be very exciting times, because this disruption really has been bubbling away in the background for a number of years, and then suddenly it seemed to explode at the beginning of this year. So, we've seen 10 months of it's almost like a lifetime has been compressed into 10 months in some cycles. So, I guess where you are at sort of leading the practice in this particular area, it must be a very exciting times for you.
Yeah, undoubtedly. It's a much quicker learning curve than what you get in other spaces. I mean, you'll see a lot of references, just like you'll see references to Web 3.0. You'll also see references to the speed at which, blockchain and ICOs is moving is 2 to 3 times quicker than the speed at which the internet was moving. And what that also means is that the speed of kind of learning needs to move pretty much that quickly. Whether it's kind of new concepts with tokens themselves that are done in a creative way, or it's just keeping up with regulations globally. Because I think as an attorney in the ICO space, I think understanding US laws in this space is not enough. Yes. While we can't be experts in the laws of every country, I think it's very important to understand what developments have occurred in certain countries so that you can advise your clients on those issues.
So this really is, the beginning of true globalization. Who'd have thought it would come from something like I remember I went to a conference 3-4 years ago where Tim Draper was talking about the blockchain. And I said to myself, I really ought to go and find out what he's talking about. And then, of course, 3 years passed instantly, at which point I would have been able to make several $100 million, I would have thought, just by buying a Bitcoin. But you're right. It's the speed of change. It's aggressive. It's fascinating. It's scary. It's going to leave a lot of people behind.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I don't know how many people could possibly echo your view on having bought Bitcoin just a few years ago. They're definitely envious of those who have.
Yeah, I think the worst thing is if you did buy Bitcoin and then sold it thinking this is not going anywhere. That's probably the time when you wake up every morning and sort of, scream at yourself in the mirror.
I've definitely heard many of those stories.
But anyway, talking of screaming at yourself in the mirror, I have my fabulous 10-question questionnaire now. So I think now's a good time to hit you with my 10 questions.
I couldn't have imagined that these were gonna come out.
Exactly. That's right. So again, kudos to James Lipton from the Actors Studio. Thank you very much. I'm talking to my attorney now, so please don't sue me. But I guess as long as every time I say these are yours, it'll be fine. That's my reading anyway. But my first question to you, Mark, is what is your favorite word?
Blockchain. No, so I say that as a joke, but people have started telling me that I'm so passionate about blockchain that I'm starting to think that might actually be my favorite word because it's such an interesting space.
But it is. No, listen, it's you're the first person to say that, so I'm sure you're leading the way there. And my next question then is, what is your least favorite word?
Failure.
So it's not centralized then.
That's good. I like that. No, but failure just isn't an option. You got to work until you succeed. Failure just can't happen.
And what are you most excited about right now?
I'm going to have to take this away from the business world and say my family. I got a few young kids and I love it. So that is definitely the thing I'm most excited about.
Fabulous. And what turns you off right now?
Definitely the political environment. I think you might have heard that a few times, but it's just it's disappointing as a Canadian. Seeing the kind of two sides that folks take in the U.S. is sad. It would be nice to see more progress made.
And what sound or noise do you love?
That's a really good question.
I know. And thankfully, they're not. I wish they were mine.
I'm going to have to say papa.
Oh,
which
beautiful.
is French for dad. And when I open the door at night and then it's the greatest sound in the world.
That's fantastic. And what sound or noise do you hate?
Screech on the chalkboard.
Oh, really?
I'll never get over that one.
Yes. What's your favorite curse word?
Motherfucker.
That's brilliant. Yes.
I hate saying it, but it is.
It is just that is one of the greatest words. I think that is absolutely superb. And what profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
That's a really good one. I would love to be an actor.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
I think that would be fun, but I'm never going to be one.
Well, never say never. Failure, someone
That's
just
right.
said, is not an option.
Not an option. That is a good point.
I'm going to replay that tape to you over and over again, until and you're like 20 minutes from LA, for God's sake. So.
That's right. That's right.
What profession would you not like to attempt?
Investment banker. I deal with them all the time, and I was one for a summer, and that was enough to tell me that running numbers is not the thing for me.
One of the hardest jobs, I think, in terms of expectations.
Oh, no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
And my final question then, Mark, is if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You took great care of your family.
That's brilliant, Mark. Well, I can't begin to thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking to you and exploring all these amazing things that are going on in blockchain and cryptocurrencies. How do people get hold of you? How do they find out more about what you're doing and how you can help them?
Yeah, I'll give you 3 ways to do that. First, my email is mboiron, BOIRON @rutan.com, or you can reach me at 714 338-1861, or you can check out my blog at blockchains360.com.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant. Marc, thanks again. It's been a real pleasure. And, look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. It's been fun.